we'd like to start by giving Julie a chance to talk a little bit about her work on the Gospel of Mark and to respond to a couple of questions from the house. We will then have each of the panelists address a question to her. It can either be based on the word that they were studying and how that impacts Mark, or something else that they have been raring to ask Julie. And we'll have Julie's responses, and we will then have other questions directly to Julie. Depending upon the time, we may end with having each of the panelists ask a question to Julie about, actually have each of the panelists respond to why Mark is an important gospel for us to study. I sometimes do an informal poll of my religion classes when we start the New Testament. I say, which is your favorite gospel? I know this is getting to be a really old joke for me. But unfortunately, Mark usually kind of draws last. And those who vote for Mark, I think, do so because he's the shortest. I don't think that there is a wide appreciation of really how powerful a portrait of Jesus it portrays. So, Julie, if you can take the microphone nearest to you, we would like to ask you to share with us for 5 or more minutes, as long as you would like, to say or share with us some things that you learned about Mark's gospel as you were preparing the commentary. In particular, we've already had one question from Eric Jensen about how it affected you as both a scholar and a homeschooler and a mom, etc. So why don't you go ahead and start, Julie?
Thank you. So, of my life to be able to work on this volume, there are many people who could have easily done not only as good of a job as I did on it, but far, far better. But I'm the one that had the privilege of the time and the space to work on it, and I'm really grateful for that. I also received a lot of support from this project, all different kinds of support from mentoring, various resources, so I'm grateful for that. My work on the book was at about the same time as a new approach to the study of Mark and some other texts became very popular, and that approach is looking at the text as a performance. So an analogy I would use is Shakespeare never wrote a play with the intention that you would sit alone in a room and read Act 2 from a piece of paper, right? That written thing that Shakespeare wrote was only a tool for the actors. What Shakespeare intended for you to do as an audience member is to show up at the theater and watch it performed. You as an audience member would never have had any interaction with the text. The text was just a tool for the actors. So the thinking goes that with Mark, and possibly with some other biblical texts, that people are encountering it and that it's meant to be encountered as a performance. And so this changes how we look at it in a lot of different ways. So it was an interesting moment to be working on the book as this idea was gaining a foothold in scholarship. And I think the reason it was gaining a foothold is because it was so productive, is in many ways you interpret the text differently if you are thinking about it as something someone experiences as a performance as opposed to something they experience as a written text. And then also because it makes us aware of this incredible distance, since most of us are reading it alone or reading it in print or focusing on a written word on the page, whereas most of Mark's early audiences would have been illiterate and would have presumably encountered the text as someone performed it, probably from memory, perhaps with a text in front of them. So it was an interesting moment to be working on this text, and performance studies did influence a lot of how I interpreted the text and helped me find things. Eric, you had something on one of your slides this morning. I hope I don't misstate it, but I think your phrase was something along the lines of not just the content of the text is inspired, but also the form. Is that fair? Okay, good. So that was something that resonated with me because I saw that in Mark as well. And it's that the form in so many ways, and you saw a little bit of that if you were here for my presentation this morning, that when we see things that look like stage directions, they're not just stage directions, they're nodding at something else that's going on. I also mentioned this morning that we have these structures in Mark. The one I mentioned this morning is we have 5 controversy stories in a row. What I didn't get into is in each one, the opposition to Jesus gets greater. Now, the text may be structured that way for the very simple reason that if I am going to deliver to you an hour-and-a-half memorized rendition of Mark, it's a lot easier for me to remember if I know next comes the 5 stories where people come to Jesus with annoying, difficult questions, and they're meaner to him in each story than in the one before it. That's a lot easier than me just trying to remember 5 random stories. So there may be that element to it, that some of the literary structures we see in Mark are there to actually help the performers. That would also apply to what I said this morning about the predictions of Jesus' suffering and death. There's 3 of them in Mark. Each one is followed by the disciples misunderstanding something and expressing that, is followed by Jesus reteaching them, and there's a paradox in his teaching. And again, as a performer, it's easier for me to think, this isn't just random, unconnected stories. We have this pattern. The pattern has 3 parts. It's repeated 3 times. It makes my job as a performer easier if I am the person who's speaking Mark's text to you. But I think there's a bit more than that. I think there is, as Eric suggested, some inspiration in that. In the first instance, we see opposition to Jesus increasing, and we see how he handles it as his mission progresses. In the second one, wow, there's a lot there, more than I can do justice to in just a few words, that every time Jesus talks about his suffering and death, the very first thing that happens is his closest disciples say something that shows that they do not understand what he's teaching. That alone is fascinating to me, and I think we could spend a lot of time thinking about it. And then, to me, it gets even more interesting that what happens right after that is Jesus reteaches. So that's an interesting response to misunderstanding, is reteaching. And not only that, but there's a paradox in it. So that gets really interesting to tease apart. So these were all things that interested me, that I worked on as I worked on it. And I hope it's something that readers find useful. I think that's all I want to say to start.
Okay, so you don't want to address Brother Jensen's
how please it remind me.
You. It was, more seriously, how has your work on Mark influenced your own life and your family?
So the time period, the years when I was intensely working on it, most, if not all, of our dinner table conversation was me trying to process what I had read. So my poor kids, who at that point were upper elementary to teenagers, got an earful, and my husband's an engineer, so they got an earful. So it very much shaped our family culture as we talk through various ideas. Everything I discovered in the text I wanted to share. So it very much was a big influence on our family at the time. And I would say for me personally, it comes back to your observation of, like most members of the church, I've always known that the stories, the content were inspired, but then to study the forms and the way it is taught and the way it's expressed more closely helped me see some layers of inspiration in that as well. So that's how I would describe the main impact on myself and my family.
All right, thank you, Julie. Before we ask each of the panelists to direct a question, it doesn't necessarily need to be on their word today. I just want to make a few observations. Even though I saw this commentary in its initial versions, I took some time this week not to reread the whole thing. It's almost 1,000 pages long, but particularly the beginning and end matter, the front matter and the end matter. And for those of you who have not seen the commentary yet, to help prepare you for Julie's approach and perhaps to entice you to buy it, I just wanted to share a few really, really interesting observations. First, in terms of what she said in regard to its form or its narrative content, she did something which I don't know that we could have done with Luke or Matthew, some of the longer Gospels, but she actually produced her entire rendition as part of the introduction. So in addition to taking it bit by bit, section by section, she has, beginning on page 26, according to Mark, and then it goes all the way up to page 54. And she actually says, readers may benefit from reading the entire text of the new rendition in one sitting in order to experience its narrative impact. Something else she did, which I thought was really wise, because commentaries can grow to many volumes, is she lays out for readers exactly what she's doing and what she's not doing, acknowledging that many things other commentaries do are useful, such as reception, history, etc., but she lays out these are important things, and this is where you can read more about it, but these are the issues that I am choosing to focus upon. And then she goes forth and lays out some things which I think are very useful. This is in connection with what I did this morning, discipleship in Mark's Gospel, starting on page 10. Women in Mark's Gospel. I mean, it was a happy, well, not serendipity. I think it was a wonderful blessing that Julie was able to do this. We need more women in scholarship, and she pointed out that there are some specific pericopes or scenes in the Gospel of Mark that have impact for women, like the woman anointing Jesus, the woman with the hemorrhage. And so she wanted to make sure that a woman's encounter with this text was represented. And then she has a discussion on Christology. I learned something from Julie several years ago. I was a subscriber to the old school that Mark was the lowest Christology and John was the highest. And she makes a very, very, very good argument for what she calls a full Christology. So when you're reading this, you'll want to read the front matter carefully. It's not a lengthy introduction. In fact, some of the things that we usually see in introductions, such as authorship and some of those discussions, she puts in her appendices. But I do want to ask, now that we're shifting to questions, I want to ask her about a particular choice she made, which I thought was impactful and is an interesting approach. She lays out in her introduction and her approach to the commentary that as she moves section by section, pericope by pericope, she's not going to give you just one interpretation. In fact, she employs the device of lists. She will literally not enumerate the number of different interpretive approaches to that passage, not necessarily in ascending order, but to illustrate that a text can be polyvalent, that there can be multiple readings. So Julie, would you go ahead and respond to that, how you came to that decision, and why you think that's a particularly useful approach for a commentary?
Sure. So I came to it out of desperation. My husband helped me clarify that I had been seeing myself as the White House press secretary, where my job was to justify everything that had been done in the text. We all know it doesn't matter who the president is, the White House press secretary is a horrible job to have, right? And he said, instead, you should be like the friendly old Jewish man who says, we can do this, and this will happen to you, or we can do that, and that'll probably happen to you. But it's your body, it's your choice. And I kind of resonated with this metaphor that in some situations, it is extremely clear what's happening with the text of Mark. There's no for example, did we lose the microphone? Hold it up. Straight on. Okay. There's some things in Mark that are not debatable, such as that Jesus is presented as the Son of Man who suffers and dies. Okay? Those things we don't have a list for. That's really clear. However, there's a lot in Mark that is not 2,000 years later abundantly clear. And at a point in an earlier project where I was looking at the Gospels where I felt like I must solve this problem and I must tell my audience the one true thing, it just doesn't work when it's not clear what the one thing is. And so what I developed was this approach, which people tend to either love or hate. And I do recognize that because I hear from the ones who hate it, of just sort of laying out a list of possibilities and saying, here's a half dozen ways that different interpreters have read it. Here's the evidence for it. Here's the evidence against it. Go figure it out yourself. That's what you have the Spirit for. I'm not doing your work for you because I can't. And so that's something that I brought to this commentary where I tried not to assume more than the text did. I tried not to pretend to a clarity or a certainty that wasn't there on some issues. And so that's what the lists are for, are situations where I feel like there's more than one viable option. And my job as a writer of a commentary is not to tell you the one I like best or to try to somehow solve it when everyone else can't solve it, but just to set the options out for you and let you solve it. From a devotional perspective, I think this approach is helpful for members of the church because I think if an academic approach to scripture study has anything to offer to our community, it's that it provides us opportunities for the Spirit to speak to us. And if I tell you a fact or an interpretation, I don't know that that gives you as my reader as much of an opportunity to ask the Spirit something as if I give you a list of a half dozen options and you go, huh. I feel like that's opening up more of an opportunity for you to approach the text in a prayerful way, in a pondering framework, and try to work through what the Spirit might want you to take from the text. So I think it's academically justifiable in situations where we just simply don't have certainty about something. And also from a devotional perspective, I think it's probably, if anything, more useful than me giving you one interpretation for me to offer several or a half dozen and leave that to the reader to work through. So that's what I did, and that's why I did it.
I would note for our audience that she co-opted no less a weighty authority as President Oakes to justify her position. One trouble with commentaries, President Oakes wrote, is that the authors sometimes focus on only one meaning to the exclusion of others. Okay, I'll ask my panelists to quickly be formulating their questions while I feed her 3 questions from the audience. So Julie, just treat each of these. I'll feed them one at a time, these 3 questions, and then we'll start with Richard with Agape and just go down the list. We'll start with Tom. Thank you. Thank you, Jack. So Tom, be just thinking for a moment as Julie quickly responds to these questions. We have an English specialist in the audience who had a particular question about this whole idea of performance. Is there specific evidence that the Gospel of Mark was recited from memory to an audience, or is this simply a hypothetical possibility that scholars have studied that may or may not turn out to be true?
Okay, so I'm hearing there are almost 2 separate questions. One is, was it done from memory, or would the speaker have had a text in front of them? And I don't think we have the evidence to settle that question. In terms of how the audience is encountering the text, we know that literacy rates are extremely low in the first century. They're even lower for the kinds of people who tend to be attracted to early Christianity or to the way. So because illiteracy is a near universal for them, they are almost certainly encountering the text spoken to them. That, I don't know that there's a whole lot of room to debate that the average early first century follower of Jesus is hearing the text as opposed to reading it. Whether the person performing it has a text in front of them, a written text in front of them, or has memorized it, that I don't think we have enough evidence to decide.
All right, let's take one more from the audience, and then we'll go to Tom. There's a question about this infamous issue of messianic secrets. So as you worked with the Gospel of Mark and the proclivity in this gospel, and to some extent the other synoptics, to have Jesus forbid people to go and say the great things he had done for them, what was your take on that?
Yeah, I don't know that that concept works well in Mark. It just looks to me like the evidence is all over the place, where sometimes we do have Jesus commanding silence. Sometimes it's silence with an exception, like the leper's not supposed to say anything to anyone except for the priests. With the transfiguration, we have nothing until after the resurrection. But then sometimes, like the man who has the demons cast out of him, he is given permission to tell. So I just see the evidence is all over the map, and therefore difficult to adjudicate that question.
Okay, if you will pass the microphone to Brother Tom, we're going to go in chiastic fashion. Tom will pose a question to you, then Richard, then Brent, then Michael. So we'll just kind of narrow it into you, Julie.
All right. Well, Julie, did you consider much of the Passover Haggadah material that Dr. Bowman and others have written about in Australia, which tends to culminate in the idea that in the miracle stories, the nature stories, that there is an unveiling of a Passover theme. And it's very big in his book published by SBK. And because we know there's a lot of Aramaic sources, a lot of textual variants. And I just simply wondered if you have considered much of the Haggadah information.
Thank you. I'm not super familiar with their work. I would say in general what I've focused on more in Mark is there's a consensus that a key theme is discipleship, and that Passover themes are not as trenchant in Mark. And so that was more the direction that I took it in. But thank you for that question. Now we're going. Oh, but they have a microphone. Okay.
One thing I like about Greek is it is the language of love. There are 8 distinct words that can be translated as love. You can translate them other ways, affection and kindness even. But, boy, I tell you, when a Greek fellow says to a Greek gal, I love you, she knows exactly what it's on his mind because of the precision of those words. And so we come down to Mark, where in John and particularly in Paul, love it plays such a strong piece in their theology, and yet in Mark, why we're just kind of hanging out there. What do you think, Julie?
Great question. So I think with all our speakers today, Eric made us feel guilty for counting how many times our word occurred in the text. I think the point he makes, which I agree with, is that it's more than numbers, but I do think the numbers are important. I think numbers can give us a relative sense of what's happening. But the point that I would like to make is in over-focus on a certain word can lead us to ignore things that are important. So, for example, in Mark's gospel, Jesus is hugging little children, which I think of is indicative of at least one kind of love, right? But the word isn't used in that story. And so what I think one of the, and this I would definitely chalk up as another trend in Mark, one that would predate my work on this, but certainly continues, is a focus on narrative instead of titles or just words. And again, those word counts do matter, especially when we're doing comparative work, and it does matter how often a word is used and in what ways. But we always want to look a little bit more broadly and be sure that we're not missing really important material if we want to talk about love, like Jesus hugging little children. So, and I think you do see that in Mark, and I think you see that as revelatory of his character.
Julie, if you'll pass the microphone to Brent, please.
Julie, I just wanted to ask you about the idea that Joseph Smith teaches that these Gospels are testimonies, and I was just wondering what you think would be the central theme of Mark. Is there a word, maybe a Greek word that we've been talking about today that may be a central theme, or would you say that some of these concepts we've talked about today are more on the periphery of Mark's testimony?
I think there's a good consensus that the big theme in Mark is discipleship, and it's not always necessarily correlated with the word, but the theme is there permeating. And I think some of the ways that comes out is, for example, in Mark's Gethsemane scene, there's a surprisingly large amount of material about how the disciples are reacting or how it shows Jesus as following the will. I think that's something else that happens in Mark is the language in the King James is often as followers or following me or followers of Jesus. So it may not resonate with us with that word disciple in the King James Version, but the dynamic is happening. And I do think it's very productive as an exercise to think of every story in Mark as being about discipleship on some level. And if I did have to pick one theme, that would be it.
I'm afraid my chiasm is lopsided, so before I'm going to hand the microphone to Michael, and then we'll go to Kent, and then Jack will be the center of our new chiasm, which seems to be pretty appropriate. I would just do a quick follow-up, although I certainly agree that it is a testimony. I would point out, as Julie does and as Kevin Barney and others have, that the evidence is actually that the JST manuscripts, the New Translation manuscripts, actually only changed the title from Matthew and John and not from Mark and Luke, despite what the footnote in our editions say.
Okay, I'm going to straight on. Is that working? Speak louder. Like a voice from heaven. Okay. Lost my train of thought. The passage in Mark for the mysteries.
Hold the mic closer.
It's on?
There we go.
So I just have to hold it right in my beard. my beard is muffling it. Okay. All right, Julie, in the passage in Mark where Christ talks about the mystery, two things there. One, he's the only one who uses the singular rather than the plural. And secondly, in connection with what you were just saying about disciples, he defines the disciples as the 12 and those who were with him, with the 12. So why do you think he is more particular in carefully describing all of those who were there, where the others had, it simply said disciples in the other two Gospels?
Sure. So on mystery, the sense that I get in the Markan usage is that a mystery is something that will be uncovered if you follow Jesus. And this fits very well with the theme of discipleship. I really do think it permeates almost every aspect of Mark, that a mystery can't be understood unless one is following as a disciple. And this gets us back to the idea of being on the way, right? So I think that's going on there. And then as for your second question, I think the picture of discipleship in Mark is unknown and perhaps challenging to Latter-day Saints in some ways, namely because in Mark's gospel, the 12 are often the example of what not to do. And I don't know how many of y'all read the Berenstain Bear books to your kids, grandkids, neighbors. This is what you should not do. Let this be a lesson to you. Is the refrain in the book is the dad makes mistake after mistake. And really, it's not a horrible analogy for Mark's gospel, where the 12 make mistake after mistake. Jesus corrects them. And I think there's several things going on here. One is that we are seeing them in a very, very early stage of their discipleship in Mark's gospel. And we being the audience of the gospel, learn from their mistakes. So they don't understand a parable. They say to Jesus, we don't understand the parable. Jesus re-explains the parable. That's a great opportunity for us. We get to hear the parable a second time. So it shows us these future church leaders who are not currently church leaders, they're just getting started. It shows them in the position of teaching us, but here they're sort of doing it through their own mistakes because they require reteaching, and so we as the audience get the reteaching through their mediation. It also highlights Jesus as a teacher. One of the main characteristics of Jesus as a teacher in Mark is he is so patient with these disciples and the reteaching and the need to reteach. And again, with those three predictions of his suffering and death, they make mistakes, they don't understand, they want to know who's greatest. He patiently, paradoxically, but patiently reteaches. So part of the picture in Mark is that the 12 are not the 12 in Mark. The 12 are the newest, greenest missionaries in Mark, and we're going to learn from their mistakes. The people in Mark who are already exemplary disciples are the minor characters. They're people like the widow at the temple. With her two mites. They tend to be peripheral characters who have a very small scene, and I think that one is a great example of it, where Jesus, if you were thinking of this as a film, Jesus is sort of turning the camera towards this woman. She's not asking for any attention. She's very quietly going about her business in this bustling area, and Jesus says, look at this. He's the one that draws the attention. So in Mark, the exemplary disciples are the people who are marginalized figures. They usually have one cameo scene. They show what it means to follow and do the right thing and enact God's will. The 12 are primarily learners who, to the extent we're learning from them, and we should be, but what we're learning is what not to do, and we're learning how to teach patiently as Jesus teaches them. So again, that's not the perspective you get in the other Gospels. It's maybe unfamiliar to us, but I think it's very helpful, and I think it helps us understand better what Mark's doing and better understand Jesus' character, particularly as a teacher.
Thank you.
Eric, I have a couple of questions from the audience. Do you want me to respond to those or ask Julie? Okay. One of the questions is, as there are degrees of light, are there degrees of darkness? My answer is I'm not sure. There is a passage in Luke 22 when the arresting party has come to Gethsemane. Jesus says something like, well, I was with you every day in the temple. You didn't lay a hand on me. What's the deal? He says something to the effect that this is your hour and also the darkness. And I suppose that's a spiritual characteristic that these people bear who have come to arrest him. There's also the darkness that I referred to in some of what I said today. That is a darkness in that place where spirit prison is. And that's fairly characteristic, I think, of Scripture to talk about that as darkness. Art certainly portrays it that way in pieces that usually carry the title Anastasis, which means resurrection. You see Jesus standing at the hole that leads into the subterranean world. And the gates are now knocked down and so on. We also have hymns that talk about this. And he's helping out Adam, and behind him is Eve. They're the first two out whom he invites out. So they come out of darkness. That's where they've been all this time. How dark, I don't know. I don't know whether there's some kind of little bit of light or light sources. Then the question is, the spirits in prison are in darkness. What and how is that accomplished? I don't know where this place is. That might tell us a lot about what the characteristic of the darkness is. But it seems to be a very dreary place. So my question to Julie, in chapter 6, which interests me because Jesus goes back to Nazareth, and he shows up in the synagogue, and people are generally negative towards him. They call him this one, which seems to be a way to talk down about him. They also ask where did he get all this wisdom and power, which is an indicator, I think, of the fact that he didn't show it in his youth or even in his young adulthood. Nobody knew that this guy had all these abilities, but you also suggest that being an artisan, carpenter, metalworker, whatever he did most of the time, was something of a lower, represented something of a lower class. And you cited some sources. I do remember, I'm trying to recall my memory, rabbinic sources that talked about herdsmen as being untrustworthy, people whom you don't want to be around, as well as card players and those kinds of things. What's your sense? I haven't necessarily picked up this sort of negative overlay to that story that you did.
Thank you. So I think this is a great example of a situation where we wish we had a lot more information and could speak far more definitively than we can. We do know that Nazareth, who spoke about this today, is basically Nowheresville, right? So we have Jesus from a very small town. We can speculate. We can speculate on his literacy. We can speculate as to whether he was Greek-speaking. I don't know that we need to speculate too much about his poverty. That's clear from the fact that the offering they're bringing to the temple when he's born is the turtle dove, right? We know that he's not a wealthy person. And so these are some question marks. I think that the negativity that I take from their response to him is a combination of it is hard to see the spark of divinity in people we are close to in any situation, and so we see some of that with the townspeople, and then also that his family's of, as it's presented in Mark, of no particular reputation or social standing or anything like that that would lend credence or authority to his words from that perspective. One thing that you mentioned that I think is interesting and that comes out in other controversies in Mark is the fact that sometimes his opponents admit to too much, frankly. They testify of his power and authority because they want to know where it's coming from, or they think it might come from Satan, but by doing so, they're acknowledging that he does in fact have some power and authority. So we get an interesting sort of witness even through the complaints and the questions. But I wish we had more answers, and I think at this distance we just simply don't.
I think that, oops, is on? It's going, okay.
Put it in your beard.
Yeah. I think that this reaction of the local townspeople, they didn't know who this person was, but I think Mark's audience does. And so an audience can always feel superior when they know the answer and something's going on there in the story or on the play, on the stage, that others are missing. And I think as I read the Gospel of Mark and hear it out loud, I really do think the performance theory is powerful. And I recommend that if you haven't done that. It was a while ago, but I remember a time in the Madsen Recital Hall here at BYU, we had a Canadian performer who came, and the whole show was a one-man show. He walked out onto the stage. He was dressed in kind of just rough sort of clothes that you could imagine somebody in the first century might have been wearing. Sat down at a little bench on the stage, and said, I just want you to pretend that we're all here in a tavern somewhere in Galilee, and I want to tell you a story. And then he did recite by memory every verse, every word in the Gospel of Mark. Took a break halfway through, at a strategic moment where everybody was wondering what's going to happen next. But it was an amazing performance. And we don't give our memories credit. You can memorize a lot more than you think. And there's been some interesting study of how people in the ancient world really used their memories a lot better than we do because they weren't contaminated by media. And I don't memorize something because I know I've got it in the book. They didn't have books. And so your brain tends to hold on to and memorize things that you know you're going to need to have. And I think that the memory theory allows for a lot of things. And the performance as a drama, we think that dramas are just for entertainment. Not so in the ancient world. I mean, why were the plays of Sophocles and Aeschylus, why were these written? These were all written as part of the games, honoring Dionysus, honoring the Olympian gods, or it's all a part of religious drama. Brother Nibley talked about religious drama and why we have drama in the temple. Why do we depict these things that way? It's because, for a lot of reasons, but one of them, I think, Julie, you're absolutely right on giving an opportunity for lots of different readings, because audiences love to go home after watching a play and dissect what they've seen and how they reacted to it. And a good play, a good Shakespeare play, will leave a lot of questions, just very provocative thoughts in your mind. And Mark does that. So I'm glad we have four Gospels, 4 witnesses, actually with Thomas 5 and maybe others. The Gospel of Thomas. Okay. And, Martin Harris and Oliver Cowdery and David Whitmer and various Book of Mormon witnesses, in some ways it problematizes things because they didn't tell exactly the same story. But in other reasons and for other ways, it's nice to have their independent voice and to have a Mark and a Luke and a Matthew and a John. People say, well, I can't believe those witnesses because they don't agree with each other. But then, we only have one witness of, say, the destruction of Masada, and that's Josephus. And what do people say about that? Well, you can't believe Josephus. He's only one witness. So you can't win until the archaeologists actually go and find exactly what Josephus was describing. And that's what Julie's done for us. You can believe this. It's credible. As Phil Barlow says, it's a trustworthy commentary, going through and pointing out things that really do make a wonderful witness of the Savior. Now, I'd like to ask a question, kind of based on who you think the audience was. And do they know the story thoroughly? And this is reinforcing the story that they know. Are people hearing? Are these new initiates, or are they first-time investigators? Who is this audience? Is this work aimed at? And is that even the wrong question? Who is a Shakespeare play aimed at? Was it the rabble or the aristocracy? And, well, guess what? It kind of plays to everyone in its own way. But one last little clue about who this audience might be. I'd formulate my question this way. Shakespeare didn't make up most of his themes. Most of his stories were not just the historical ones, but these are stories that are well-known and popular and circulated, and maybe some had already been dramatized before, but Shakespeare's able to do it better than anyone else did. But they're all working with material that the audience understands and maybe appreciates the little twist that's here or there. So when I read Mark, I don't think that he's the first gospel written in the sense that he is composing this for the first time. I think he's drawing on a stock of stories that had widely circulated. And I think he's drawing on the Sermon on the Mount, because there are many passages where he just uses things like the salt of the earth, or the lamp in the bushel, or going and reconciling with your brother, or teaching on divorce, or those things that are coming at the audience as recognizable parts of the story. So with that comment, do you want to say a little more about who you think this is playing to?
Sure. So I see it as a wide audience, and again, this is not something that we have any sort of definitive evidence to point to, but I think there is definitely material in Mark that is far richer if you have a background in the Old Testament and Hebrew Scriptures. So I think partially it is written to an audience with that background because they will pick some things up. But I also imagine there are people in the audience who don't have that background. I imagine there are people very familiar with Jesus' story, people hearing it for the first time. In other words, I think the audience is all over the map. Based on what we can tell, we wouldn't have any reason to expect that the audience would be segregated and would choose not to listen to Mark if they were already familiar with it, or vice versa. So I think I understand the audience, at least based on the limited information we have, as representing a wide range of experience with stories of Jesus, with Judaism, with knowledge of these stories in general. I agree with you that there are probably pre-existing chunks of text before Mark writes them down. We see some candidates for that. For a long time, it's been recognized that what's called the Passion narrative, so the story of Jesus' suffering, death, and resurrection, is a good candidate for that. I've pointed to some other instances where a section of the text larger than one story seems to make a coherent section that you could imagine traveling around before it ends up in a gospel. So I think that could have happened. Again, we don't have the hard evidence we wish we had for this, but I think there are hints of that.
All right. Well, sadly, we only have a few minutes left. There's one question about the authorship of the book of Hebrews that we're going to have to defer until we
don't ask me that.
The volume on Hebrews. So maybe next year at our conference we'll be able to do that. So Julie, I'm just going to give you 3 questions, 2 from our audience, and just take a minute for each. One is about the concept of covenant. I know the word diatheke only appears in Mark 14, but do you, as a Latter-day Saint reading this gospel, see more sense of covenant involved in it than usual? 2, what have you learned about women from this gospel? That's an important point, as we've already alluded. And then finally, will you just make your sales pitch to our friends? Why Mark? Why should we all start by reading Mark?
Okay, so covenant, women, and marketing. So on the covenant issue, marketing Mark, not marketing my commentary. On the covenant issue, I don't see covenant per se as an enormous theme in Mark. I think as Latter-day Saints, we have the light and knowledge to see that in the discipleship theme, but I don't think that's made explicit in Mark. In terms of women, I might tell you a story. When I had my first child, he's a little under a year old, we had the misfortune to live somewhere that had carpet under the kitchen table. If you've ever had little kids, you know why that's a problem. So spending a lot of time picking slobber-coated pieces of Cheerio out of the carpet on my hands and knees under the table. And as I was doing so, I gained great insight into Mark 7, which is where the Greek woman, wants the exorcism for her daughter, and Jesus says, let the children first be fed. And the woman says, the dogs get the crumbs under the table, because I was working with the crumbs under the table. So I tell that story to say that even 2,000 years later, this is still a story that resonates with women's lives in perhaps some unique ways. And I think one thing that thinking of Mark as a performance tells us is there is almost a process of natural selection when it comes to oral performance, in that plays don't stay on Broadway if no one's showing up. And by that I mean, if audiences don't resonate with stories, they do not continue to be told. And because of that, we come to the stories in Mark and we say, who is this story resonating with? People put some effort into telling this, and they wanted to hear it. Who's hearing it? Well, there's a very lengthy story in Mark that focuses on menstruation. Who wants to hear that story? There's a great quote from a scholar of Judaism, I believe his name is Baumberger, who says, "Ancient man reacted to the phenomenon of menstruation with a horror we can scarcely imagine." And I'm like, no, I've met some men. I can actually imagine that horror even today. So you think about that story and you think, who's telling this story? This is not a story you're telling to the deacons' quorum, right? I mean, they're just squirming off their chairs before you can even get the story finished. This is a story that's told and retold and ends up in the canon because it was meaningful to women who were relating to it. And so again, getting back to your insight, Eric, on it's not just the content, but it's the form, I think we bring audience into that and we say these stories survived because they resonated with people. There are presumably dozens of stories that were important in their own way, but that didn't get told because for whatever reason they weren't resonating with the audience, but this one was. And so that was something that I tried to ask myself as I worked through this, is why is this story important to people and who is it important to? And it may not be our usual suspects. Okay, in terms of marketing, and again, marketing the Gospel of Mark, not marketing my commentary on Mark. An analogy I like to use is that Matthew and Luke are CES employees who work in Salt Lake. Mark is a stake president in the Bay Area who lets homeless people sleep in the gym. So this is a different view. This is not the suited, buttoned down, by the book, following the rules, every rule all the time. That's just not what Mark's story is. It's very much rough around the edges and compassionate to the extreme and concerned with everyone, except sometimes the Greek is bad in the text, and sometimes Jesus is a little rough around the edges, and so Matthew and Luke clean it up before they let us get to the text. So Mark is just different. It's a different view. Jesus actually doesn't say a whole lot in Mark. He mostly acts. There's no Sermon on the Mount in Mark. There's no farewell discourse. He teaches by doing. He teaches by performing miracles. He teaches by interacting, and he uses that as a teaching opportunity. As I said before about discipleship, in some ways this is a very different story from what we would get if we took the Gospels as a whole or if we focused individually on another Gospel. And I don't think this is any sort of an accident that Mark is in our canon. I think this is a view we need. I don't think it's the only view we need, or it would have been the only one there. But I think it's a view we need, and it's a view we tend to neglect. So that's my sales pitch for the Gospel of Mark.
Well, we thank the members of the panel, and most of all, let's give a round of applause to Julie. And we'll have Virginia close our conference and introduce our closing prayer.